In thinking about time, I found that incredibly refreshing to hear the elected leaders have an opportunity to have a conversation that was longer than 30 seconds. And I hope you agree with me. I think it's a very difficult job to do when you need to talk about how the country works and how it can work better in the context of a scrum. And so I'm happy that we were able to provide that opportunity, I think, for a fuller conversation. At the same time, the Confederation of Tomorrow conference, the original one was 4 days long, and I understand the Quebec Premier's opening remarks were 40 minutes, someone said to me last night. So I think we achieved a good balance here, and I hope you agree. And her crowning achievement, of course, is former director of the Canada Millennium Scholarship Foundation, where I had the pleasure of working with Janet. So thank you very much, the three of you, for coming, and take it away.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Andrew. Very much appreciated. And thank you all of you for braving our first big winter storm here in Toronto. I know from other jurisdictions they're used to snow like this, but for Torontonians this is usually an existential moment. So we're pleased everybody was able to get here today. So it's my privilege to moderate a wonderful panel here. Andrew neglected to tell me that I was going to be a moderator after Steve Paikin, which is always a tough act to follow. And you guys have two former premiers, or current premiers, to follow as well. So we'll see if we can meet the standard that was set by the session this morning. So back in 1967, of course, as everybody said, 50 years ago, and there are actually some people here who not only attended, helped organize, etc. Such a wonderful event and fairly unprecedented in its time. And there's an old saying that the good old days were formerly known as these trying times. And I think when we look back on 1967, we think of it as an age of incredible optimism, where government's role was seen as being a positive force in society, able to do good, where I think most of our social problems that we were facing, economic or otherwise, seemed solvable, as opposed to, I think, when you look at some of the challenges we all face in our respective governments. And the role of provinces and states were, I think, just starting to get out on the front stage, if I can put it that way. As Steve mentioned, it was a provincial premier who convened the Confederation of Tomorrow. So today we want to sort of roll forward 50 years and talk a little bit about the role of provinces and states these days in our national and international role. I mean, in this how have our provinces and states fared in our sort of Twitter-obsessed, globalized, deglobalized, alt-left, alt-right, alt-middle, climate-changing world of 2017? So we have two people here who I think are well-equipped to offer their observations on this. We have, of course, Governor Malloy, who's been the Connecticut governor since 2011, and has focused very much on economic growth and innovation in his state, but also recognizing that the social agenda, investing in education, investing in housing, investing in healthcare, are also great ways to support that innovation, economic growth, protection of the environment that he has been focusing on in Connecticut. The other thing that I think is probably of interest to Canadians is that in last year, Governor Malloy was named the recipient of the John F. Kennedy Profile Encourage Award for his defense of the U.S. resettlement of Syrian refugees. So the fact that the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation felt that this was a worthy courage award gives Canadians some sense of the tone and tenseness of the debate in the United States on some of these issues. I'd like to also, we're very pleased to have with us a former Quebec premier who actually made it a bit of a family business, being the son of a premier and the brother of another premier of Quebec. But,
three different parties.
Pardon, sir?
Three different parties.
Three different parties, okay. We could have an interesting discussion just on that. Thanksgiving dinner must have been wonderful in your house. But not only is he counsel to Lavery, DeBillay attorneys of Montreal, but he has also been Quebec's chief negotiator on the CETA negotiations, and also very involved in many of the noteworthy, newsworthy international issues, both for Quebec and the United Nations. So very experienced in negotiating from a provincial perspective on international matters. I think it's also worth noting that he accompanied his father at the original Confederation of Tomorrow conference some years ago. You were a babe in arms, I suspect, at the time, right?
A little more than that.
Yeah. So we're very pleased to have them here. They're going to both make a few sort of opening comments to set the stage. I have a couple of questions to ask them. They may even want to sort of discuss with each other their various views. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time from you in the audience. So I'd like to start first by calling on the governor to make a few comments about where he thinks sort of state relations are these days in the current environment. Governor.
Well, first, let me say that I'm not sure things are all that different. In 1967, you had an illegal immigration problem, a lot of young men from America crossing the border and not going home. So things are complicated at any point that you're in government. Sometimes as a leader you make it more complicated, and sometimes as a leader you solve some of the complication for folks. I think the real question that I should be asked is, what the heck am I doing here, an American at your conference to celebrate an event 50 years ago? But I received the invitation, and I have to tell you, I was intrigued to read the history of that conference and understand, in some senses, its political/cultural significance, and so I was anxious to be here. And I have to tell you that, having heard the prior panel and participated in hearing some discussions last night, I'm very glad I came. I suppose the perspective that in some part I'm supposed to bring is how are we different and how are we the same, and perhaps a comment on the state of American politics as one Democratic governor of a medium-sized population state, but small geography footprint, views things. And so I'm happy to do that, and we'll attempt. But let me begin by complimenting you. I mean, I think that most Americans think of Canada as that place up there where everyone naturally gets along because they're so damn nice. And you're all our cousins, and I don't think Americans give as much thought or study your country or your processes to the extent that they should. And so I really do want to say this, that I think what was accomplished in the bringing together of the country. I'm reminded, I was out in PEI this year, and the famous story about the fathers of the Confederation coming to PEI for their conference, and not being met by the townsfolk because the circus was in town and everybody went to see that first.
Not much has changed.
Well, the circus is in Washington, is what I said there, and I'll say it again. You have a very different politics. I understand things get hot, but your desire to have consensus and your desire to continue to have consensus in a world that's more complicated and more divided than perhaps ever before really is quite a tribute to you all and to your leadership over decades, not simply measured on a short-term basis. In the United States, it is a very different proposition. I happened to speak to the Premier yesterday here in Ontario at her office. Governors aren't asked their opinion too often. And so on issues such as trade, we are very much outsiders and not brought to to the main table to give our advice. In essence, what states become in situations like that are like corporations. You hire a lobbyist, or you try to find a way to have your voice heard through whatever's going on. That's certainly very much true in the tax debate that's going on in the United States today. There's not a governor in the country who thinks the tax package that's likely to be produced by the end of the month is actually good for them or good for their state. There is a reality. See, I have a cousin here.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
I think that it is a very different proposition. So when I met with the Eastern Premiers in August in PEI, there's a very different expectation with the role that they should play and the role of the provinces should play in that kind of debate. That simply does not exist in the United States. Now, there are some folks who get bigger, perhaps whose voices are heard a little bit louder, whether it's Texas or California or New York or someplace else. But by and large, states are excluded. And that really goes back to the fundamentals of our Constitution versus your agreements. And, once in, you're never out. We had a pretty significant war between the states on that issue. And as a result, we really do have very different national politics and very different relationship between the states and the federal government.
Okay.
I will say there are some exceptions. I think states are playing, at least a group of states, mine included, are playing a lead role on the environmental side with our own separate agreements. I would argue almost large enough to make sure that the United States, if each state does what it says it's going to do, we can almost guarantee we could meet our national targets. Because you have California, and you have New York, and you have Massachusetts and Connecticut, a lot of your neighboring states pulling in the same direction and saying, quite frankly, our president is terribly wrong about this. And quite frankly, a good amount of our Republican counterparts are wrong about this issue. But that's separate and apart of the agreement itself. And so I think there are some distinctions. There are things that are thought to be purely of a federal context, and Washington is very careful to draw that line.
Okay, thank you very much, Governor. Premier.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me on your panel, and I thank Mr. Parkin for organizing this meeting. I never thought celebration of something more than 49 years would bring such an audience. I'll talk to you about, very practically, the presence of the provinces in the negotiation with the European Union, and how I think it's changed quite a few things, and probably will for the future, not only in that area, but possibly other areas. First of all, the context in 2006-07, Jean Charest, then Premier of Quebec, who's a staunch free trader, tried to convince some people in Davos that it would be a good thing that the EU embark in negotiations with Canada on that issue. And Mr. Harper, who had not initiated that initially, but took the ball and very convincingly decided that it would be the next free trade agreement Canada would sign after it had signed a series of them with Latin American countries, of course, of less magnitude than Europe. Europe, I'm reminding you, is 28, soon 27 countries with 500 million people. It's a larger economy than that of US. Average wages are similar to those of Canada, although not as high as in the US. And it's the largest trading jurisdiction in the world. Why should they be interested in 35 million Canadians as consumers? So as Canada was pushing for this, the Europeans became pretty clear about their main objectives. And their main objectives were twofold. One was to have access to public procurements from the provinces and municipalities in Canada, because it's about $100 billion a year. And if you're a European, you can do anything. I mean, you can make tables, chairs, satellites, planes, name it, 28 countries, 500 million people, probably the highest square footage of universities in the world. So what was of basic interest for them was precisely the public procurements market. Secondly, some intellectual property issues which were related in one of them to their eventual negotiations with the United States, which was the recognition of geographical indications. Jambon de Parme cannot be a jambon du Wisconsin ou de Latuc. If you have a specific appellation for given eating products, whether they're cheeses or meats, you hang on to that. The US has always been very resistant to that notion. Why? Because it's a country which was formed, as we were, incidentally, by immigration largely in terms of its population, and people bring with them their traditions. Europeans don't like the idea that you'll give the same name to a wine or to any kind of product that it has in Europe. So it was one of their objectives also, and we did make some concessions on that. The issue was more fundamental than just cheese and meat and a few other things. The issue was about free trade, and for those who are not really familiar with free trade, let me try to summarize what a free trade agreement is about. Parties get around a table and they agree on basic principles of movement of goods, movement of people, movement of capital. Secondly, they agree on the fact that each jurisdiction will discipline itself in terms of favoring that maximum movement of people, goods, and capital. And thirdly, they negotiate 1,000 pages of exceptions to what I just said, which is why sometimes lawyers come around usefully. Not always. And usually at these negotiations, you don't have lawyers around the table. Why? Because we'd still be talking about Chapter 1. You have essentially economists, people who come from the public sector, public policy specialists, people who have a background in business administration, to which are added various specialties. Essentially, the idea was to get to a point where we would find an agreement. So we all know that interprovincial commerce and international commerce are federal jurisdictions. So why should the provinces be there? Because in constitutional law in Canada, the federal government cannot impose a substantive issue which is from the provincial jurisdiction sector. So the federal government could not commit that the provinces would open up their public procurement markets, or even in the services sector, that they would loosen some of the regulations, including on necessary residence to hand out certain services, etc. So the federal government, well aware of that, and Europeans actually imposed the fact that they wanted the provinces to be committing to the substantive issues. The federal government, in a series of exchange of letters between Mr. Harper and Mr. Charest, and then Minister of Trade Stockwell Day and Prime Minister Charest, agreed basically on provincial participation, which took all sorts of forms along the way. Essentially, it was full membership in the Canadian delegation, presence at the tables where provincial jurisdictions were discussed, provincial substantive issues were discussed, and of course, an immense amount of meetings, briefings, pre-briefings, post-briefings of what was going on, including sharing the basic mandate of the federal negotiator, Steve Verrill. Incidentally, Canada's in pretty darn good hands in NAFTA, since Steve Verrill is also he thought he'd retire after Europe for 7.5 years. He's now heading the Canadian effort with the NAFTA negotiations, which is not exactly a vacation. At the first meetings where the chief negotiator brought us in buildings in Ottawa, we were about 120 people from the federal government and from the provinces. The largest delegation was Quebec, which had 8 people. Second largest was, would you believe, Newfoundland. Under the following notion, we're not a have-not province anymore. And that's how it was told to us by a deputy minister of trade from Newfoundland. That first meeting of just the Canadian side, which was about 50 people, some people of the federal government around in the second row were actually wondering what the heck the provinces were doing there, because they were not used to have the provinces in the rooms. And it was essentially a trust-building effort over the first few weeks. And it worked. And it worked because the trust-building manifested itself in the use of different language of negotiation. For instance, we sort of have an unwritten and even unsaid rule that we would not start a sentence amongst Canadians by the word no, which was a big improvement on any federal provincial meeting in history. But we would replace the word no, but yes, but.
That's progress in federal-provincial relations.
But I think it's significant of the approach and the attitude. Why? Because there was a broader objective upheld. And the broader objective was to manage to have that agreement with the Europeans in a perspective where we think prosperity and more prosperity will come from it. And that the presence of the provinces was absolutely essential to the process. What happened eventually was an agreement, incidentally, which has been in force since the 21st of September. Although it is called provisional application, it is in force voluntarily on both sides, and most provinces have adopted the conformity legislation. Quebec, of all things, being a little late because it had a strike of its legal officers for months. So we're a little late in the process of adopting the final legislation, which is the conformity legislation to the Act. The substance of the agreement is about goods, abolition of all industrial tariffs between Europe and Canada. Secondly, major diminution effort through cooperation of non-tariff barriers. Thirdly, a recognition of each party's capacity to certify a good for environmental, health, or security reasons so that it has access to the market through our own laboratories. So Canadian laboratories will give both the Canadian certification for goods, and they will apply the cahier de charge, the criteria of European access to the market provisions. And that will help a lot, mostly small businesses whose presidents won't have to take the plane 3 times to get their new electronic gizmo approved. It's also about services, and it's finally about freer circulation of capital, intellectual property issues, of course, public procurements, open on both sides. The public procurements market in Europe is larger than Canadian produit intérieur brut, gross national product. So it's quite a market out there. Even if we had a small chunk of it, would be interesting. And finally, agriculture, culture, cooperation, environment, education, and labor. So it's a major agreement, which was brought about, I believe, by the quality of the relationship and the efforts made on both sides to understand each other's, in spite of some funny events. Now, I'll just finish with that. At some point, I was at the table on alcoholic beverages, which are important for Europeans because it's one of their largest exports to Canada when you talk about France and Italy and Spain. And it was interesting because there were 14 of us on the Canadian side, about one person from every province plus a couple of others. And there was only 2 persons on the European side. It made quite a photo of what it means to have provincial participation in the context of an international trade negotiation. I think in conclusion that a good thing happened there because that presence of the province allowed Canada to have a much better hand at that table and allowed us finally to bring about what is a very good deal for Canada and a pretty good deal for the Europeans. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes,
So let me give you a 1-minute comparison to the United States. Our Constitution has the Commerce Clause. And the Commerce Clause was put into the Constitution by our founding fathers because what gave rise to the war that led to our independence was some folks passing a tax on tea. And there was a decision that the federal government, or the government to be established, would have the say not only on commerce on an international basis, presumptively with our ally France and then enemy Great Britain, but also that someone would need to make sure that commerce was free between the jurisdictions, between Virginia and Massachusetts, or Connecticut and New Jersey, or any other combination. And that's given rise to a very, very different approach to these issues. And that's been true of the original NAFTA and all of the agreements before that, and quite frankly, all the agreements after that. So by and large, states are lobbying for results, but aren't ever at the table. And it is really a fundamental difference that is represented in how we became a country versus how you all became a country.
No, and I think that's a really, really important point when you look at the different role between a state and a province. But Governor, given what we're seeing in the NAFTA negotiations is a great focus from Canadian politicians, both federal and provincial, on state governors, state sort of the political class, if you will, from the state side. And as you said, state politicians are speaking up very loudly because they have a lot economically at risk too if we don't get a better deal or maintain a current deal. Do you think that's changing? Do you think the role of states is starting to grow coming out of this, or could grow coming out of this in things as important as NAFTA?
No.
Okay.
You invited me to be honest, so I might as well. I think that there is a misunderstanding in Canada about how that plays itself out in the United States. And so, in essence, talking to one lobbyist talking to another lobbyist is just that. It's not talking or speaking to the folks who are at the table. I see no evidence of the Trump administration spending a lot of time with any of the 50 states on what should be involved. Now, the soft lumber issue might be different because it doesn't have, we don't have a true lumber industry in Connecticut, or even your neighboring New York State doesn't have the lumber industry that it once had. So there are a fewer number of states that are involved in that actual issue, and that might give rise to they're having more impact on that one part or that one discussion. But on a broad-based basis, I don't diminish our role, but I want you to understand it. It's one of trying to have a voice heard, raising a concern, being a lobbyist for a particular subset of issues. And it is not a partnership, and shouldn't be viewed by Canadians as a partnership between the 50 state governments and the federal government. You're making a terrible mistake if that's how you view it. I will, having been involved in some of the earlier free trade agreements that the United States passed and ultimately gave rise to NAFTA, the only time that states were brought in was when they were looking for support for an agreement that had already been reached. There's a political role when it comes to gathering a sufficient number of votes in the Congress to pass one of these things, but it's a very different role.
Should they bring the states in more? Because we've seen an example with CETA where the provinces were brought to the table in a way that I think was pretty unique for an international agreement. And I think there were those in the early days who thought, oh my heavens, oh my God, this is going to blow, it just won't work, because we're used to seeing provinces and federal governments squabble over issues over the course of years, but it does seem to have worked. Should they bring the states in? Would that make it better if they involve the states more in things like a NAFTA or other agreements?
Yeah, I suppose it would. I mean, I think, when we think about California, a state a fraction the size of Canada with a population of 38 million people, and yeah, I think we should probably get their point of view on the things. But there's this you can't overcome the fundamental difference, and that is that in the United States, in the Constitution that came about years after the war had ended, there was a decision made that commerce would be controlled by the federal government, and that very same commerce clause that gives them the ability to determine and negotiate in the commerce sector those agreements is actually also been used to change state behaviors. Commerce and public accommodations were put together as a way to defeat the Jim Crow laws in the South in the 1950s and early 60s. It was the Commerce Clause that said you could not discriminate on a state-by-state basis based on race. That had a financial impact, and so we shouldn't always assume that because we look alike we're all that alike.
Yeah, very true, very true. Premier, what did we learn out of the CETA negotiations and the CETA deal that might be useful in other future negotiations, whether it's TPP or NAFTA or others?
No. Well, maybe to come back to what the two premiers talked about in the earlier panel, it's a lot about dialogue. It's about just keeping lines open on a consistent, systematic basis at all levels. So in our team, we had, and I think that could apply easily on, let's say, environmental issues facing climate change legislation and more constraints on industry in these areas. When you look at the way Canada is constituted with oil and gas in the West, still quite a bit nuclear in Ontario, essentially hydroelectric in Quebec. And so these are not simple issues, but they cannot be accommodated with dialogue. So without dialogue. And what happened with the CETA was a way to have the professionals at certain level in our team talk with their vis-a-vis in Ottawa on transportation, on various issues which were related to the negotiation and which could have been of mixed jurisdiction or even only of federal jurisdiction in certain areas, let's say, of the financial sector. But they would talk to each other at a fairly junior level. Then we would bring that up to the directors in the departments, eventually the assistant deputy minister, and then myself with the chief negotiator. And on very sensitive issues like culture, for instance, for Quebec, which is fundamental. Why? Because the principles of free trade say that you don't subsidize without certain restrictions. And secondly, you can't impose what is obviously discriminatory. Like, for instance, we impose on librarians to have a minimum amount of Quebec literature to get their license. And the reason is pretty simple. We're a small population. Not many people read French books in North America. And if people don't have access to these books, there'll be even less, and we'll lose our writers. Another example in the case of culture is that Quebec laws prohibit a publisher to be majority owned by a non-Quebecer. Why? And the answer is simple. If you let Hachette in France buy their equivalent, which are small in Quebec, they will not print books of poetry which sell 200 copies a year. It's as simple as that. They'll print books which sell a lot. And these books are probably French rather than from Quebec. So this is typical discriminatory legislation. So we needed an exception in the case of culture that the agreement would not apply to culture. So the principles of national treatment, etc., would not apply. And we had exceptional cooperation, but ultimately that was solved between ministers. So you can go at whatever level you want on certain issues. The politicians, the elected people, those who are accountable in front of public opinion have to be in the circuit to make the final decisions. The same was with agriculture. So it was beef and pork against cheese. Long story short, we don't import that much cheese in Canada from outside. Why? Because we have a supply management system which guarantees the people in rural areas that they'll get transfers, not from governments, because governments in the US subsidize agriculture, and governments in Europe or the EU subsidizes agriculture. We don't subsidize the milk sector in Canada. Consumers do. You pay $43 a kilo for good cheese, whether it's French or made in Ontario or Quebec, as a rule, whereas you would pay on the free market possibly 25. And that's why we have, this is the reason why we have that, is we have huge tariff barriers against cheese coming from outside, because we have a mode of redistribution of wealth, which is not subsidization, but consumers paying for the good at a higher price, which goes into the countryside. It's a very different philosophy, and to give you an example of what practically it meant during the negotiation, I met the chief negotiator of Europe a few times, and often alone. But I met him at a reception organized by the Quebec delegation in Brussels. And he comes sort of laughingly at the beginning of the negotiation with champagne glass in his hand and saying, "You're going to abolish this cheese restriction market, won't you?" I said, "You bet. We're going to put it on the table. We'll totally abolish all of that if you abolish subsidies to the agricultural sector in Europe." And that was the end of conversation. And they didn't abolish it, and we didn't abolish the system in Canada. It took, with the federal government, quite a bit of pull and tug. Why? Because the provinces didn't have the same opinion on the subject. Yeah. So that's why it took a darn good dialogue. We conceded some quotas to the Europeans, and they conceded beef from the West and pork from the East. And we got a deal.
Yeah, and if you've, those of you who've heard our former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney talk about the free trade agreement with the United States, at the end of the day, it was the personal relationship between the President Reagan, and the Prime Minister that actually broke the logjam on some critical issues. Yeah. So that relationship issue is really, really important. Governor, you brought this up, mentioned this, excuse me, in some of your remarks about issues around climate change and whatever. And so to both of you, how do you see states and provinces contributing to your various countries' strategies or approaches to climate change issues?
Well, this is an area where states can and in fact, in some cases, do play a much larger role in the state-federal relationship. Although, quite frankly, that's under attack from the Trump administration, which would rather diminish the role that states play. But as I appear here today, we can have stronger regulations than other states, and we do. We can set higher targets for renewable energy and establish systems to bring about those results, one of which was the first green bank, a successful green bank in the world, which was done by Connecticut on a government basis. Now, I do think that since the administration is filled with climate deniers, that they would prefer to diminish or have diminished the authority of state governments. But I think that that's one area where a fairly significant number of states will fight back. And so I think we're going to continue to play this larger role. And I think that's the significance of our RGGI agreements, which are a version of cap and trade amongst a number of eastern states. Similarly, in the last 24 months, something very similar has been established between California, Oregon, and Washington. So this is an area where states are moving forward on the environmental issue. I think that's a very good thing, and I'll go so far as to say that perhaps we can pull America to honor its long-term commitments under the treaty abrogated by the current president. And there are those kinds of issues where states play that larger role. But because of the original design of our Constitution and because of how we came about, I think we're going to have to be very careful to protect those. So I fully expect that if the administration in Washington finds something that Connecticut does on environment because we are being too strict, that might very well be challenged, and an attempt made to find a court that would rule that challenge might be successful.
Premier?
Well, it's interesting to look at the environmental sector indeed in the case of Canada, because the provinces have natural resources jurisdiction. Secondly, they have taxation power. Thirdly, they have a very large regulatory capacity, space to occupy. So the conclusion is that they can play a role. The conclusion is not necessarily the federal government should step in. And it's really a matter of how you approach these issues with some distance, without the emotions of feeling that the disparity of approaches in Canada in certain types of policies will by definition atomize the country. I mean, the CETA is an extraordinary example, I think, of where the provinces intervened with jurisdictional powers to say yes or no in certain areas of a fundamental agreement. And it worked out well because there was a positive approach by the federal government in terms of the participation of the provinces, rather than a reaction, which I call the centralist reaction in our history of federalism, which would be, no, if it comes from the provinces, it's probably not good for the nation. Whereas the reality is when provinces are engaged in a process where they work together in a direction not of asking for more money from the federal government, which will always feel threatened by that. You won't change that. But when they work in around a fundamental policy issue, which is largely, whose instruments to implement it are largely under provincial jurisdiction, when they work together, it happens. And it's happened even in climate change, even though it wasn't easy. What's important is that it happens.
Okay.
Well, let me share an experience that's playing out in the United States currently. We needed to change our Constitution to bring about a national income tax. And it was a hard-fought battle. But one of the, but not written into the Constitution, but one of the things that has always existed was that state and local taxes would be a write-off on federal taxes. There would be an adjustment made. That's under attack by the current administration. I mean, a big part of this budget package would be paid for by doing away with that parity of treatment. So high tax states, I happen to be from one of them, but most of, many of the states that you neighbor, are high tax states. The administration is attempting to cap the deductibility of those taxes at $10,000. Where in Westchester County, for instance, in New York State, outside of the city, the average property tax bill alone is $16,000. And of course, that doesn't include other forms of state income tax and the like. This is because of the way that the income tax came about in the country, and because of the simplicity of the language, and because of the lack of a secure agreement that said in that language that forever those taxes would be treated that way, we're now going to have this conflict. Now, some states will argue that this violates the Constitution, and they'll make certain arguments, and clearly the federal government will argue a different case. But it is very interesting that because it didn't exist, because it came about after the original Constitution, because language in shaping the Constitution in the United States tends to be short, brief, and simplistic, we're going to have this question come to the fore when I don't think people 2 years ago would have predicted we'd ever have this discussion. Maybe even a year ago would ever predict that we would be currently having this discussion, and it would be one of the biggest turning points with respect to that package. Differences.
Yeah, absolutely. Very much so. Just to encourage those in the audience, if you are thinking of some questions, we have a microphone at both sides of the room there, so please make your way up, and you have an opportunity to ask some interesting questions or provocative questions of our two panelists. So while we have one already. Okay, go for it.
Thanks very much. This is really fascinating on so many levels, and so I have questions for both of you. The first question for the governor, what do you think is the likelihood that NAFTA will be re-signed?
Simple question.
Simple question.
Re-signed.
NAFTA,
like as in
re-signed.
that it's going to be re-signed, like that we're going to manage to successfully renegotiate the NAFTA agreement. And for you, what specific strategies, maybe could you give one or two, that you used and developed as all the provinces were at the table negotiating the EU agreement so that there was some sort of unified front? Because, there's diametrically different positions on many of the trading questions. And so what was maybe one of your best take-home strategies that perhaps we could use domestically to try and resolve conflict? Thank you.
Good question. Okay, Governor?
I woke up the day after the election and I decided I was going to hold my breath for 4 years.
How's that working for you?
It was an utter failure. Listen, I think the trade between Canada and the United States is very important to both of us. Connecticut is the third most intensely invested in aerospace state in the nation. It's Washington State, Kansas, and Connecticut. And so much of what we do, and our three leading trade partners are Canada, France, and Germany, and that order changes from time to time. And a good, gigantic part of that trade is actually in aerospace. So I can't imagine that we're going to disassemble in its totality that relationship. So yes, there will be some sort of continuation of NAFTA. I think it's been revisited before. I think it's appropriate to revisit it in ways that sustain its original purpose. I do think, and I've said this to a number of your premiers, that I think Canada has the potential of being the collateral damage of our president's dislike of the Mexican country and its people. And I would posit that I can't imagine what California and Arizona and other states would be like today if there hadn't been economic growth in Mexico, or what immigration would have looked like if some of the good things that happened to Mexico as a result of NAFTA. Having said that, it's appropriate to visit these agreements from time to time and make appropriate adjustments, and I'm hopeful that will happen. I think the failure on the soft lumber agreement is not encouraging, and the ability to do it at the table. But I think ultimately and fundamentally we have to find a way to get this done, and I think it will happen. But I don't know what year.
Okay.
Although technically, I mean, NAFTA is going to go on until it's ripped, thrown off, and I don't think that will really happen, although our hypotheses are there. I guess the threat of ripping NAFTA might be conducive to something in the tug of war between the president and Congress, because generally speaking, my perception now is that there are quite a few people in Congress, including the Senate, who favor the maintaining of NAFTA and who would radically oppose throwing it to the dogs and going back to zero and WTO rules. So at the end, I'm confident in this extraordinary check and balance system in the United States, where you can go through a crisis, but ultimately common sense can prevail.
I'm hopeful, but there's precious little common sense anymore.
Yes, as somebody once said, common sense is not very common very often. Premier, she also asked a really interesting question about what strategies or what things worked to kind of herd all the cats with the CETA negotiations amongst the provinces that might be adapted to some of the other issues that the Federation is facing here these days.
Well, first of all, listening. You can imagine, I mean, just 10 provinces present through different type of negotiators. Sometimes we're really professionals who do only that, who've been doing it for 20 years. Others were more of political appointees, which was my case. Eventually from Ontario, there was an assistant deputy who was appointed head negotiator. At the beginning, it was a professional from the government. So you can imagine the diversity. So the first thing is get together a lot. Listen to what the federal government tells you and react to it, but react to it amongst yourselves also. We had lots of interprovincial meetings, and that's what ultimately allowed to find a common trunk on all our decisions and be able to give Steve Verboel a good card in his hands to play when it came to public procurements, some parts of services, and I would say some rules related to energy and energy ownership. So the first thing is you listen, you talk a lot, you spend just a lot of time so that the biases get off. I remember talking with the head negotiator of Newfoundland. As you know, between Quebec and Newfoundland, it's not always easy. And
Master of understatement.
and at some point, he made a radical sortie around the table amongst Canadians within the Canadian delegation one evening, and it was absolutely excruciating remarks towards the federal government. And I told him, you know, Steve, if I said that, people would tell me I'm a separatist. And it had the advantage of showing that a psychological approach, a commonsensical approach amongst provinces was the only thing that would bring about the capacity to form consensus on various issues. And at the end, we were able to form consensus in 1 hour's discussion on certain issues because we'd worked at them a lot and we were given space and place to do it.
Yeah.
And ultimately, on federal mandates, I mean, they were controlled by the federal government. Sometimes there would be back channels to the politicians in Ottawa by the politicians of the provinces on certain issues. But generally speaking, it's about looking for consensus to be built.
Okay, all right, yes, we have a question here.
Thank you. We heard from the governor how the role of the state is very restricted when it comes to international agreements and international trade. In Canada, the federal government has similar primacy. However, especially with respect to Quebec, we see it going out in the world and it has very strongly articulated international policy in terms of agreements. It's been signing a lot of bilateral agreements with many different countries. Do you think, one, is that something that Quebec is able to get away with because of its special role in Canada? Or two, is this an opportunity that other provinces should be taking in, specifically in signing more bilateral agreements, in going out on the international stage and almost bypassing the federal government?
Yeah. First of all, I mean, the fundamentals are the Maritime Bank case at the beginning of the 20th century, which said that there were 11 crowns in Canada. And since international relations were a privilege of the crown, if you had 11 crowns, it means, and that allowed Paul Girard-Lajoie to build the so-called doctrine Paul Girard-Lajoie, which said we have the jurisdiction which is in continuity at the international level of our internal jurisdiction, which allowed, Quebec used it massively, not recently. I mean, it goes back to the mid-50s, actually, when it started. And I remember during Expo 67, the Quebec government signed, I think, 13 or 15, I can't remember exactly, agreements with various countries on education and social issues, and social transfers and reciprocal, and we have that in the case of les lois du transport, legislature, le code de la route, yeah. Help me. I'm in French this morning. If you do a driving...
Driver exam? Driver's license?
No, not driver's exam. You do something you shouldn't do when you're driving.
All the time.
All the time.
Yeah, yeah.
We have agreements with U.S. states on these issues, as Ontario, I think, does too. So you can implement a judgment from an American court here or the other way around. And that's very pragmatic. Now, Quebec holds dearly to that. Maybe the difference between Quebec and some other provinces is precisely that. We hold dearly to our capacity to entertain international relations, especially in the field of culture, of health, and in the case of the economy, in very specific areas where, which are related to natural resources. Yep. And I think that's not going to change.
Okay, let's see if we can, oh, sorry, Governor, go ahead.
Just quickly then give you the American version of that. These agreements between states and other countries or subsets of those countries really aren't given the primacy or the legal effect. They are agreements to do something that are perhaps mutually supportive but have no power of law. They don't go back to the legislature for its approval, and that's the clearest sign that it has, for the most part, no legal authority. We enter into them, and we abide by them, but it's more of a voluntary thing that passes from one administration in a state to another administration voluntarily.
One last question.
I guess that my question may almost be redundant because of the responses both of you have given, but my question was, to repeat, was if governors have little influence on international trade pacts in the United States, can you explain the merit of ongoing state and provincial government discussions on trade matters?
Well, you know, we don't have the authority to enter into binding agreements under our Constitution to the same effect that was reserved in your Confederation. That doesn't mean that states don't play a major role. I mean, you know, in seeking to attract foreign-based jobs to a state, states frequently enter into agreements to well, in some cases, some form of subsidy. We won't tax you if you do X, Y, or Z, if you build your factory in Tennessee or in New York or in Connecticut. There are that role is played by states and state governments, usually authorized by the state legislature to give authority to an economic development group or agency to do those kinds of things. But by and large, we can't negotiate the cost of bringing a raspberry from France to the United States. That's not something that we can do, and quite frankly is anything but largely reserved to the national government. So it is a different situation, and I think many of these agreements are simply voluntary agreements to encourage commercial exchange, cultural exchange, but we do compete on an economic basis. So we do play that role, but that's more of an enticement as opposed to a regulation. There are some. This is not 100%, but I think I'm giving you, in reality, how America does these things, how the United States does these things, versus certain powers that have been reserved and on a much broader basis to the provinces.
Okay. Well, I always used to like to describe, when I was in elected office, like to use the words of the founding fathers of our two respective countries to describe the differences that the United States with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and of course in Canada it's peace, order, and good government. So I'd like to, on behalf of all of us here, thank our two panelists who gave us some very good observations. So. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.